Okay, so you ready for this? We're doing a deep dive on wolves. Your research totally blew us away, so get ready to have your mind blown.
Yeah, it's really interesting how wolves kind of capture this whole idea of how interconnected ecosystems really are.
Totally. It's like, forget the fairy tales where they're the villains.
Yeah.
These guys are like the superheroes of the ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Like we were talking about before, we've got some amazing stuff here about this whole rewilding thing and how wolves can help forests grow back. It's pretty wild.
Right, and the key to understanding that is this concept of a trophic cascade. It's not just about what wolves hunt, but how their presence changes the behavior of their prey. And that, ripples through the whole food web.
Okay, so walk me through that a little bit. You're saying that just knowing wolves are around changes how other animals behave.
Yeah, exactly. And a classic example, one you sent over actually, is Yellowstone National Park. It's like the perfect case study for this. For decades, Yellowstone was missing a really important piece of the puzzle, which was wolves.
Right, they were gone for quite a while, weren't they?
Yeah, and without them, elk populations went through the roof. And this wasn't just a few extra plants getting eaten. I mean, this overgrazing was changing the whole landscape. It had a huge impact on all kinds of plants and animals.
So what happened when wolves were reintroduced back in '95? How did that change things?
Well, the results were pretty astonishing, and the thing is, it happened really quickly. It really shows you how resilient nature can be.
That's where the aspen trees come in, right? I was reading about how they made this big comeback after the wolves came back.
Exactly. You see, without wolves around, the elk were just chilling, eating wherever they wanted. And a lot of times, that meant munching on all the young aspen trees. They were eating them before they could grow up. But then the wolves show up, and suddenly the elk have to be a lot more careful, They start avoiding areas where they might be vulnerable. And that change, just from being afraid of the wolves, let those aspens and a bunch of other trees finally start flourishing again.
It's amazing how something like having wolves around can change something like tree growth. You wouldn't think they'd be connected.
Right, but that's the trophic cascade in action. But it goes even further than that, too, because the aspen trees coming back, well, that had its own ripple effect.
You mean the beavers?
Yeah.
You sent over some research on how they started moving back into Yellowstone, too.
Exactly. Beavers need those aspen trees. They use them for food and to build their dams. So more aspen means more beavers. And more beavers means more wetlands, which is great for all sorts of other creatures, too, like amphibians, fish, birds, insects, you name it.
So it's like this incredible chain reaction. The wolves come back, the elk get a little more cautious, the trees come back, the beavers move in, and suddenly, bam, the whole ecosystem is healthier and more diverse. Just incredible.
It really is. And it just goes to show you how interconnected everything is in nature. But it's not just a Yellowstone thing either. You sent over some fascinating research on wolves in other parts of the world too, right?
Right, and that's what's so fascinating. It's not just this one place. This is happening in Europe, too. And the wolves are having this huge impact on those ecosystems, too.
Absolutely. And each region offers its own unique insights,
Okay, so Europe. What kind of impact are wolves having over there?
Well, you've got the Carpathian Mountains, for instance.
Okay.
They've sent a really impressive amount of forest regeneration.
Wow.
And a lot of that is thanks to wolves coming back. You see, those mountains, they'd been dealing with overgrazing, kind of similar to Yellowstone, actually, deer in this case. But bringing the wolves back has really helped bring things back into balance.
You mentioned that the research covered a bunch of different areas in Europe, though. What about some other examples?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, in the Iberian Peninsula, it's a different story. Less about forests there and more about keeping the wild boar population under control. Because wild boar, they can really do a number on crops and livestock if their numbers get out of hand, And it turns out wolves are lending a paw, so to speak, helping keep things in check.
It's wild how the impact wolves have can be so different depending on the ecosystem, isn't it?
Totally. It just goes to show how adaptable they are and how their role can change depending on the environment. That's why it's so important to understand the local situation when you're trying to reintroduce them, Make sure it's a good fit.
When we talk about wolves and this whole rewilding thing, we often focus on their impact on other animals and plants, right? But you sent over some research that got me thinking about something I'd never even considered before, their impact on rivers.
Oh, right. Yeah, the connection between wolves and riparian zones and river health. It's pretty amazing. You're talking about how they can actually help rivers just by influencing how their prey behaves.
Exactly. It's totally changed how I think about it, to be honest.
Yeah.
So for those of us who haven't heard about this connection before, Break it down for us. How do wolves have this impact on rivers?
Well, it's like this. When you have elk or deer, let's say, overgrazing near a river, they often end up eating all the plants along the banks,
Right.
which unfortunately makes the soil all loose and vulnerable to erosion. And of course, all that erosion leads to sediment building up in the river. Not good for the fish, not good for the overall health of the river.
Makes sense.
But here's where the wolves come in. When wolves are around, those elk and deer, they're less likely to hang out by the riverbanks.
Pretty risky.
Right. So the vegetation has a chance to recover, and that helps stabilize the banks.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about what they hunt, it's also about where they hunt.
Exactly. And that little shift, just them hunting in different areas, it can cause this huge chain reaction impacting the entire ecosystem. Even something as seemingly unrelated as the health of a river.
Wow, that is incredible. Okay, so we talked about Yellowstone, we've touched on Europe. What about other parts of the world?
Well, your research also mentioned wolves in Russia. They've got those massive Siberian wilderness areas.
Right.
And those areas, they rely on this really delicate balance. And wolves are crucial for maintaining it.
Yeah, I think I read something about how they help manage the reindeer populations there, right?
Exactly. Without wolves to keep their numbers in check, reindeer would just explode. Overgrazing would become a huge problem, especially in those sensitive tundra ecosystems.
Wow. So it's not just forests and rivers. Wolves are guardians of the tundra too. But I have to say, it's easy to get swept up in all the positive stuff, like wolves are amazing. But
Yeah.
And maybe this is just me, but we have to acknowledge the other side of the coin here, right? Because not all the research you sent was quite so positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, is it? There's got to be more to the story. Not all the research we looked at painted quite such a pretty picture when it came to wolves, right?
No, not exactly. And you're right to bring that up. It's important to remember that while wolves can have incredible benefits for the environment, their return isn't always easy, especially for people.
Right, like the whole human-wildlife conflict thing. That's a real concern, especially for anyone who relies on livestock, right?
Absolutely. And that's something the research addresses too. There are ways to reduce those conflicts and help humans and wolves coexist.
Like what? What kind of things are they doing?
Well, there are a bunch of different strategies. Like some places have compensation programs if someone loses livestock to wolves.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then there are more hands-on things like guard dogs, specific types of fencing that deter wolves, even alarm systems that scare them off before they get too close to livestock.
That makes sense. So they're really looking at this from all angles. It's not just like, okay, wolves are back, deal with it. They're trying to find practical solutions. But there's also that whole perception of wolves as being dangerous, that big bad wolf idea that's so ingrained in our culture. How do you even begin to address that?
That's where education comes in. It's about changing the narrative, helping people understand that wolves aren't just these mindless killing machines, They're a vital part of a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, it sounds like it's about more than just changing laws or putting up fences. It's about changing hearts and minds. But we've only really scratched the surface here. What about other parts of the world? Like, I know you sent over some research on wolves in India. What's the story there?
India is fascinating because wolves there play a critical role in grassland ecosystems.
Really? I'll be honest, when I think wolves, I think forests. Not so much grasslands.
It's true, they're not often associated with those environments, but they're just as important there. In India, they help control populations of herbivores like gazelle and blackbuck. Without them, you get overgrazing, and that can be disastrous for the whole system.
It really shows you how much we still have to learn about these creatures. And it all comes back to that idea of interconnectedness, right? How everything in an ecosystem is linked together.
Exactly. And it's not just about the places where wolves are now. Even in places where they've been gone for ages, like Japan, for example, there's this growing movement to bring them back.
Now, that is really interesting. What's driving that? I mean, why bring them back to a place where they've been extinct for so long?
Well, it turns out that without wolves, Japan's deer population has exploded. I mean, exploded. It's gotten so bad that they're causing major problems, damaging forests and farmland.
Wow, so the wolves are kind of like a solution to a problem that's already happening.
Exactly. They're hoping that reintroducing wolves could help bring things back into balance.
Hearing all this, it really makes you think, doesn't it? About how much we don't know, about all these hidden connections in nature, and what can happen when we mess with them.
Absolutely. It's pretty humbling when you really think about it. We like to think we're separate from nature, but we're not. And sometimes the best thing we can do is step back and let nature do its thing, even if that means making space for creatures we used to be afraid of.
It's like we have to unlearn our fear and embrace this more, I don't know, holistic view of nature, right? We're all part of this big interconnected web.
Exactly. And that brings up a really interesting question. What other species are out there that could help us restore balance in other struggling ecosystems? What other rewilding possibilities haven't we even thought of yet?
That is a really good question. And it's questions like that that make these deep dives so important. The more we explore the natural world, the more we realize how much more there is to learn. And who knows, we might just discover the solutions to some of our biggest challenges by looking to nature for guidance.